watch key public policy events, and every weekend the latest nonfiction authors and books on Book TV. You can see past programs and get our schedules at our websites. And you can join in the conversation on social media sites. And in a moment, live coverage of the U.S. Senate today. Senators will take up a measure from Senator Rand Paul that would end U.S. aid to Egypt. Senator Paul wants to redirect money toward building and repairing bridges in the U.S. We are expecting a vote on Senator Paul's amendment at 10:45 Eastern. Just after that will be a vote on the nomination of B. Todd Jones to head the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Mr. Jones has been the acting director of that agency for 2 years. Also today, debate on the nomination of Samantha Power to be U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. She's formerly a human rights advisor to President Obama. And now to live coverage of the U.S. Senate.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. God of grace, glory, and power, the battle belongs to you. Forgive us for fearing the future, forgetting how you have led us in the past. Forgive us also for our haste to paint a caricature of the many because of the mistakes of the few. Lord, remind us that fierce winds bring no anxiety to those who keep their eyes on you. Lord, today imbue our lawmakers and the members of their staffs with your wisdom, that they may know the road to take. Sustain those who courageously bear the burdens of the marginalized. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., July 31st, 2013. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Edward J. Markey, a senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
The Democratic leader is recognized.
Mr. President, just a brief word or two about the presiding officer. When he took the oath to become a senator, we had a lot of things going here. I didn't have the opportunity to say as much about him as I would like because we were in some thralls of a real battle here that we seem to have resolved. I don't know if there's anyone in my 31 years in Congress that has been better prepared to be a senator than the senator from Massachusetts, who now is the presiding officer. A stunning record has already been established with his work in the Senate. I have, from afar, admired this good man, and for 4 years up close as when I served in the House with him. The work for the environment has been unparalleled, and one of the rare voices that has for many years understood the dangers of nuclear waste and been aware of the benefits of nuclear power, but also the dangers. There is a long resume that this presiding officer has, and I want the record to reflect that I am terribly impressed with the work he's already done in the House and going to even be more impressed with the work that he will do here in the Senate. The people of Massachusetts are very, very fortunate to have the presiding officer as a senator from Massachusetts. Mr. President, following leader remarks, the Senate will resume consideration of the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Bill. At about 10:45, there will be a roll call vote in relation to the Paul Amendment. As I've indicated to him and others, we'll probably move to table that, but that will be up to the two managers of the bill. But I understand that's what they are going to do, or someone will do. Following disposition of the Paul Amendment, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the Jones nomination to be director of ATF. We'll do this vote just as quickly as I can work out an appropriate time with the Republican leader. I filed cloture on the THUD bill. As a result, the filing deadline for all first-degree amendments to that bill is 1 p.m. today. I am told, Mr. President, S. 1392 is at the desk and due for a second reading. If that's true, I'd ask you, direct the clerk, to report the same.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
S. 1392, a bill to promote energy savings in residential buildings and industry and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I would object to any further proceedings to this bill at this time.
Objection having been heard, the bill will be placed upon the calendar.
Mr. President, when President Obama proposed a plan yesterday to simplify our corporate tax code and lower rates for businesses, I expected Republicans all over the country, but especially here in Congress, to jump for joy. I think there were many people around the country that were satisfied and happy, but the Republican leadership in the Congress surprised me, and I think a lot of people, of their reaction. It was just a few months ago that Leader McConnell signaled he'd be open to a plan to reform the tax code. This is what he said, and I quote, "I'm told President Obama is going to come out for lowering the corporate tax rate. To the extent he wants to do some of these things, our answer is going to be yes." But it's amazing how quickly his answer went from yes to no, no. Republicans have favored corporate tax reform for decades. We've heard them say so. This was one of the mantras during the presidential campaign. But now that President Obama is proposing it, Republicans are opposing it. The president's thoughtful approach would couple lower tax rates, corporate tax rates, with investments in job-creating measures such as roads and bridges and dams, worker training programs, and manufacturing incentives. And he was in the state of Tennessee when he made this announcement, and they are a picture book as to how corporate interests there can really move on. They've done a great job in Tennessee, and I would bet that every corporation in Tennessee, they were elated to hear what President Obama had to say yesterday. Mr. President, it's going to take a balanced approach that includes smart spending cuts, closing wasteful loopholes, and ask the corporations who will benefit from lower tax rates to contribute their fair share. Even Speaker Boehner supported this approach in the past. This is what he said just a short time ago. Quote, "We want to put Americans back to work. I think lowering the corporate tax rate is critically important. And to do that, I think we have to look at the tax expenditure side, the deductions, credits, and other gimmicks that may be in the tax code that have accumulated over the last 30 years. I don't say this very often, but Speaker Boehner was right. And this is the kind of balanced approach to deficit reduction that the American people favor. A simpler tax code that lowers rates and makes our businesses more competitive, but also raises new revenue to invest in job creation. Mr. President, we have learned that the sequestration already has cut 1.6 million jobs. So we need job creation. We need to help the middle class by creating jobs. As President Obama said, if we're going to give businesses a better deal, we need to give workers a better deal also. We can use the money we save by simplifying the tax code to create jobs now, right away, jobs that can never be outsourced. Both Democrats and Republicans get something they want, and the economy gets something in the arm it needs, a shot in the arm that it needs. We've already cut the deficit in half for the last 3 years. Democrats, that's the yearly deficit, Mr. President, and we've saved already $2.6 trillion from the accumulating debt. Democrats know there's more to be done. We certainly do. But we won't agree to any plan that balances the budget by killing jobs, even more than already, and whacking the middle class. And that's while holding the richest individuals and corporations harmless. Democrats believe we must offset the harsh spending cuts of the last few years with job creation that puts the middle class back on track. To get the economy back to full steam, we should be making targeted investments in the things like infrastructure and education, things that always helped America grow and succeed.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
You know, there's not much to say about the President's speech yesterday, other than he actually retreated from previous commitments to a more bipartisan, revenue-neutral corporate tax reform, and then tried to sell that rejection of bipartisanship as some quote-unquote grand bargain. I mean, only in Washington. But let me say this. It really would be nice to see the President work with Congress for a change to get some important things done for the American people. Republicans have been eager to do this all along. But really, it's almost like there's a gone campaigning sign outside the Oval Office. A gone campaigning sign outside the Oval Office. And on the rarest of occasions, when he does come to the Hill, as he will today, you find out it's basically just another internal campaign rally with Democrats. So I hope he'll finally get serious and make one of his famous pivots, this time in a new direction, toward effective policy and away from the never-ending political sideshow. But it's hard to see, especially when you consider that the President's party is now attempting to blow up one of the most genuinely bipartisan accomplishments of the Obama era. The Budget Control Act that was agreed upon 2 summers ago represents a commitment from Washington to America. A commitment from Washington to America. A bipartisan promise to enact $2.1 trillion in spending control. Last year, the slightest hint of fiddling with the spending caps led to a furious response from senior Washington Democrats. It even led to a veto threat from the White House. But now Washington Democrats are tired of bipartisanship. The commitments they made have become an inconvenience to their special interest agenda. So now they're threatening to shut the government down if they're not allowed to break their word. That's what this appropriations debate we're having is all about. It's about an attempt to blow up an important bipartisan achievement by busting the spending caps both parties already agreed to. Well, Republicans don't believe we should be breaking our commitments to the American people. And breaking commitments in order to overspend, as Democrats propose, seems like an even worse reason for them to shut down the government. So I hope they won't. I hope they'll think about the third way offer we've made to them, too. That we'd happily discuss exchanging some of the particular cuts they don't like for government reforms. The kind of innovative ideas that can get our economy back on track and our government back in the black, not just in the immediate term, but over the long haul. This policy discussion has never been more relevant, especially when we look at what's happening in Detroit, what's happening in Europe, when we realize that the real-world consequences of putting off reform are no longer just abstract, or hypothetical. They're here. They're real. They're now. The experts tell us that the United States is already on a completely unsustainable fiscal trajectory, and that we need to make some big changes today if we want to avoid a similar fate. They also tell us that unlike Detroit or Greece, America still has some time to chart her own future, but not long. That's why the choices we make today are so important. We can follow the Democratic path to austerity, the path of breaking spending caps wide open and borrowing more money we don't have, of callously rejecting reform and blissfully denying the future. That path inevitably leads to European-style austerity, to the decimation of the middle class, to desperation for the least among us. Or we can follow the Republican path to reform and to growth, a path of smart choices, innovative reforms, and orienting our economy toward the future, a path that not only prevents austerity tomorrow, but leads to more jobs and a better economy today. A Democratic path to austerity or a Republican path to reform and growth, these are the choices. Voting for appropriations legislation that blatantly violates budget reforms already agreed to by both parties moves our country in exactly the wrong direction. It puts us on the Democratic path to austerity. That's one of the many reasons I'll be voting against this spending bill, and I would urge my colleagues to do the same, because it's time to get serious about the challenges we face. It's time to work together to reposition America for growth and prosperity and sustainability in the 21st century. And if the President is willing to get off the campaign trail and show some leadership with his party to convince them of the need for positive reforms and of the need to actually stick to them, I'm confident we can create a better economy today and leave a better future for our children tomorrow. But it's up to him, and his visit today offers a great chance to convey this message to his fellow Democrats. Now, Mr. President, on a different matter, I'd like to say just a few words about my departing Chief of Staff, Rohit Kumar, who announced a few weeks back he'll be leaving the Senate at the end of this week. Many of the members of the Senate know Rohit pretty well. He's been trolling the floor out here for a long time, telling us on the Republican side what to do and how to do it. And he's been a constant presence at my side in just about every legislative battle we've had here in the Senate for the past 6.5 years. And even before that, actually when he was working for Leader Frist, and I was over in the whip's office. So many of us could recount Rohit's many talents, but as his boss, it falls on me to do it. And I'm happy to do it, because we've been through a lot. The first thing to say about Rohit is that his mind is like a trap. He's got the answer to literally every question, and the moment you ask him. And he's usually thought through the politics of it, too. That might not sound terribly unusual, but I assure you it's rare in this business to come across somebody who combines a brilliant mind for policy and a brilliant mind for politics in one package. But that's Rohit. He's just remarkable that way. And it's just one of the reasons he's been indispensable to me, not only in the day-to-day stuff, but especially on the 3 major deals I helped broker with Vice President Biden, starting with the 2-year extension of the Bush tax cuts in late 2010, the debt limit deal we arrived at in the summer of 2011, And then, of course, the fiscal cliff agreement at the very end of last year, in which we locked in the Bush tax rates permanently for 99% of Americans. That's something we couldn't even do, by the way, when we had a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican president. Every one of those agreements involved a lot of work, a lot of nights and weekends, and tremendous focus. And we couldn't have done any of them without Rohit. Anything that ever came up in those discussions, Rohit could tell you the upsides and the downsides, where the other side was willing to go and where they weren't. He knew where all the tripwires were. And it's because of these same skills, as well as his grasp of Senate rules and procedure, that he's become sort of an informal advisor to the entire Republican conference over the years. It's not at all unusual for me to walk back to Rohit's desk and see him talking to another senator in my office, either in person or on the phone. He just knows how things work. And folks who are smart know they can call him up or swing by if they want to know what's going on or what's possible or what's not on absolutely anything. A lot of other senators will miss him every bit as much as I will. Now, Rohit said he was drawn to public service by the example of his parents. Both are doctors, but both also viewed their work as more of a calling than just a source of income. His dad is a widely respected and well-known teacher at the university level, and his mom worked at a VA hospital. Rohit wasn't drawn to medicine, but like his folks, he wanted to make a difference. And that's what drew him to politics. He got his start answering phones for the mayor of Dallas, then translated that into an internship for Phil Gramm's state office after his sophomore year at Duke. After graduating in just 3 years, he took a job in Senator Gramm's Washington office as an LA and did that for a couple of years before heading off to law school. The plan was to become a federal prosecutor. So he moved down to Charlottesville, stayed there for a clerkship on the Fourth Circuit, and then saw his plan go up in smoke when he called Senator Gramm for career advice. Rohit told him what he was thinking, and Senator Gramm listened. And then he told him he thought it would be a much better idea if he came back to the Senate and worked for him instead. So Senator Gramm can be pretty persuasive. Rohit agreed, and he's been here ever since. Now, it wasn't a straight line. About a month after Rohit got here, Gramm announced he wasn't running for re-election. But over the year that followed, he impressed a lot of folks. And it wasn't long before Senator Lott picked up the phone and asked him if he'd join him in the leader's office. Rohit accepted, then spent pretty much of his entire time there figuring out how to get the Department of Homeland Security up and running in such a way that it wouldn't be hamstrung by union rules. Then over a holiday weekend in late 2002, he got a taste of things to come. President Bush wanted DHS approved, and Rohit and a few other key staffers had a holiday weekend to do it. They started writing the bill on a Thursday night and wrapped it up by Tuesday morning. Rohit stuck around during the Frist years, gaining even more experience and impressing even more people, including me. And when Leader Frist left at the end of 2006, I brought him onto my leadership team, and it's been one of the best hiring decisions I have ever made. As I said, he's been an extraordinary help to me and just a great guy to have around. He's not only whip smart, got a fantastic sense of humor and a work ethic like I've never seen. So I want to thank Rohit for his dedication and his service to me and to the Senate. And since this is really the only opportunity I ever have to do this, I want to thank Hillary for letting us have him for this long. I think she's here in the gallery. I know how supportive she's been of Rohit staying here for so long. And so I just want to thank her for that and apologize for all the canceled trips and lost weekends. I know it wasn't always easy to see it in the moment, but he's made an enormous difference, not just to me, but for our country. I can't promise the transition will be easy. You might want to find a good 10-step BlackBerry recovery program when we finally take the thing away from him, but I'm sure he'll figure it out. So with that, I want to wish Rohit all the best in the future. I know he's got a bright one. I understand he'll be unemployed after the weekend. I expect that won't last long, but if you ever want to come back, we've always got a place for you. Thanks, buddy. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-1243, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 99, S-1243, a bill making appropriations for the Departments of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development and so forth, and for other purposes.
The senator from Kentucky.
I'd ask unanimous consent to call up Amendment 1739.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will report.
The senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul, proposes an amendment numbered 1739.
I would ask unanimous consent that we consider the amendment to have been read.
Without objection, so ordered.
A once great city, Detroit, lies in ruins. 50,000 feral dogs roam the city. Abandoned houses litter the landscape. It is a bleak and forlorn future that awaits Detroit. Creditors clamor for nearly $20 billion in debt. City employees wonder if they'll be paid. There's not enough money to even replace the street lights in Detroit. God forbid that a major fire break out. At some level, I think the President does care about Detroit, but today, all I can see is the billions of dollars, the billions of American tax dollars that he chooses to send overseas. I see the shiny new technology, America's best, going to arm people who are indifferent to us and at worst hate us. The President sends billions of dollars to Egypt in the form of advanced fighter planes and tanks. Meanwhile, Detroit crumbles. Chicago is a war zone. More people will die in Chicago this year than in Afghanistan. Yet the President insists on building a $34 million fort in Afghanistan. Hillary Clinton insists on spending $80 million on a consulate in Afghanistan that will never be used. As Detroit decays, Chicago's a maelstrom of violence, and yet no one questions sending billions of your dollars to Egypt, to despots, to dictators in foreign countries. Our nation's bridges are crumbling, and few politicians from either party will question that billions of dollars are being sent overseas while our nation's infrastructure is crumbling. The law is very clear. Everyone here in Congress can read. They recognize that the law says when there's a military coup, the aid must end. Today we will vote on whether or not they will obey the law or whether they will openly flout the law and disobey. When a military coup overturns a democratically elected government, all military aid must end. That's the law. There is no presidential waiver. The law states unequivocally that the aid must end. So when the military coup occurred in Egypt, how did the President respond? How did Congress respond? The President and his cohorts in Congress responded by shoveling good money after bad into the failed state of Egypt. The president is intent on building nations abroad and not taking care of our nation here at home. I propose that we take the $1 billion that is now being illegally given to Egypt and spend it at home. We have bridges crumbling at home. Can't we fix some of our problems at home? We've had a bridge collapse this year in Washington State. We had one collapse in Minnesota a few years ago. We have a bridge in northern Kentucky that is becoming increasingly unsafe, and yet there is not enough money to repair our bridges because your politicians are sending the money overseas. It's unwise, and right now it's illegal. Countries like Egypt are getting billions of dollars in aid. Meanwhile, they recently let a mob advance on our embassy, climb atop our embassy, and burn our flag. I say not one penny more to these countries that allow mobs to burn our flag. In between cashing our checks, Egypt finds time to convict 16 Americans on trumped-up political charges. Fortunately, the Americans were able to escape. They left the country, or we'd have 16 Americans imprisoned by Egypt. Luckily, these Americans were able to get out of the country. Now, how do these establishment politicians respond? How will the other side respond today when they get up and plead that we should break the law? What will they say about Detroit? What will they say about Chicago? What will they say about the bridges in northern Kentucky that won't be built because we're sending the money to countries that are burning our flag? I think it's unwise to send arms, particularly advanced arms, into the chaos of Egypt. I fear one day that someone may arise in Egypt who says, let's attack Israel with these planes. Let's attack Israel with these tanks. I fear these weapons that we are giving to Egypt may someday be used against America and our allies. Even the Egyptians don't want our aid. There was a Gallup poll last year that showed that 70% of Egyptians don't even want the money we're sending them. To understand why, you have to understand that American aid doesn't go to the Egyptian people. It goes to the despots and the dictators that run the place. You have to realize that when protesters gather in Cairo, when by the hundreds of thousands and even millions they gather in Tahrir Square, why are they unhappy with America? They're unhappy with America because they're being sprayed with tear gas, bought with American tax dollars, manufactured in Pennsylvania, and given to the Mubarak family or given to the military. Why are they unhappy? Foreign aid doesn't go to foreign people. It goes to foreign despots and foreign dictators. Foreign aid is more likely to buy a lavish chateau in Paris than it is to buy bread in Egypt. You send money to Egypt, it buys private jets for the Mubarak family to fly to Europe. The Mubarak family is said to have stolen billions of dollars of American aid. Over the past 30 years, Americans have been forced to finance the Mubarak family living large. So when you see pictures of depression in Detroit, when you see abandoned housing in Detroit, when you see boarded up housing, when you see 50,000 feral dogs running through the streets of Detroit, when you see a once great country, a once great nation, a once great city lying in decay, you think about your politicians who chose to send that money to Egypt and not keep it here at home. As Detroit decays, as the money is stolen and squandered around the world, but as Detroit decays, as Chicago's overrun with violence, as Americans struggle to put food on the table, Mubarak and his family dined on caviar and champagne. As Mubarak flew to Europe for weekends on his jet and lived the life of a king, his people rotted in jail indefinitely, without charge, without trial. They've been living under martial law for 30 years. You wonder why they're unhappy with us? We've been financing the guy that's been giving them martial law and indefinite detention without trial for 30 years. To add insult to injury, when they protest against their government, they're doused with tear gas made in our country. Foreign aid doesn't go to foreign people. It goes to despots and dictators. The president claims that he feels your pain. The president says he can feel the pain and he wants to help the middle class. But it seems like he wants and intends to help foreign people, foreign countries, more than he wants to help America. The president promised us hope and change, but the more he claims that things change, I think the more they stay the same. I wanted to believe that the president would be different. I wanted to believe that he would bring change. I wanted to believe that he would stand up to the arms race, to the military-industrial complex, that he would stop the flow of arms to despots and dictators across the planet. But hope and change just turned out to be a slogan. In Detroit and Chicago and in the once great cities of America, no change came. Hope and change was just a slogan. The poverty, the murders, the abysmal schools, they continued. Where are you, Mr. President? Where are you when in our hour of need in our country, why are you sending our money to people who hate us? Why are you sending arms to countries that don't like us or our allies? Why would we do that? The president maintains he will end the war in Afghanistan, and I support him. But he insists on fighting new wars secretly without congressional approval in Libya and Syria. While Detroit decays and descends into bankruptcy, the president, like so many Republicans before him, continues to send American tax dollars overseas to countries that persecute and kill Christians. Hope and change. I guess it was just a slogan. The law clearly states that when you have a military coup overturning elected government, the military aid must end. Even the president doesn't dispute the law. He doesn't even dispute it's a coup. But he just says, I'm not gonna say it's not a coup or a coup. You can't make me. It's ridiculous that any intelligent person in our country, and I wonder if any from the other side will stand up and say it's not a coup. How do you say when the military takes over a country and boots out a government that it's not a coup? Only a fool or a demagogue would attempt to argue that the military junta in Egypt is not a coup, that the military takeover that actually installed the lead general as deputy prime minister is somehow not a coup.
Would the senator yield for a unanimous consent request?
Not yet. In a remarkable bit of sophistry, the president admits that the law does not mandate an end to military aid when a coup takes place. He says it does, but he says it can't make him decide. So he's not going to decide whether there was a coup or not. What it is it's brazen and open flouting of the law. The president's argument reminds me of a third grader at recess. A third grader says, he won't call it a coup and you can't make him. It's absurd. We passed a law. It's the law of the land says if a coup happens, if the military takes over or participates in a substantial way in removing an elected government, that the military aid ends. So we're either a nation of laws or we're not. So when the president refuses to acknowledge that it's a coup, that it's not yet an acknowledged coup, he just says the aid's going to go on indefinitely. He will go on indefinitely flouting the law. Americans should be outraged and insulted by such blatant shirking of the law. Either we're a nation of laws or we're not. Will we obey the law or not? We have the presumption to tell the world how to behave, to criticize Egypt for not obeying the rule of law, all legitimate concerns, and yet the president blithely ignores our own law. If we choose to ignore our own laws, can we with a straight face preach to the rest of the world about the rule of law? I think by openly flouting our own laws, we take away from our ability to lead the world. We take away from our moral authority to show the right way. We always have been. America's always been the leader by example. But how do we lead by example when we're not going to obey our own laws? There really is a question. Are we a monarchy or a republic? Are we to be ruled by caprice? If we pick and choose which laws to obey, what message does that send? I say to all Americans, Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, that enough's enough. We aren't going to take it anymore. Call your representatives, tell them enough already. Tell them to take care of our country. Tell them not one penny more to countries that are burning our flag. Mr. President, I suggest that today we do something historic and listen to the American people. The American people don't want good money after bad shoveled and sent overseas. They want to fix some of the problems we have at home. They want to do some nation building here at home. My amendment that I will introduce shortly will give your representatives a chance to vote for this. We're going to say, yes, we will obey the law. We're not sending any more weapons to Egypt, and we're going to take the money, and we're going to build some bridges in our country. We're going to repair some roads. We're going to work on some infrastructure here at home. Everybody seems to say they're for it. In fact, the president has now come out and he says he wants some grand bargain to take some new money and actually work on infrastructure. Mr. President, it's right here. I'm offering it today. Mr. President, I have another amendment that would say all foreign profit can come home at 5%. We'd take that revenue and we'd build new bridges. They won't even let me vote on that one. So the president's grand bargain to increase infrastructure spending, I've got it. It's here on the floor. Mr. President, call the leadership of the Senate. Tell them it's on the floor and you support this, that you want infrastructure spending. I have a bill that would do precisely that. This amendment will do a little bit in that direction. Take the $1 billion we spend in Egypt and spend it in America. So when you see the pictures on the news of what's going on in Detroit, if you live in Detroit and you're suffering through the bankruptcy of your city, if you see around you the chaos and poverty of Detroit, you look and call the president. You say, Mr. President, why are you sending that money to Egypt? Why are you sending money overseas when our nation is crumbling, our cities are crumbling, our infrastructure is crumbling, our bridges are crumbling, and the president says, I'm just going to send that to Egypt. I'm going to send that overseas. This amendment will give everyone a chance to put their money where their mouth is, to say, do you care about America? Do you care about repairing American infrastructure? Or do you care more about sending money to a dictatorship in Egypt? I think the choice is clear. I think if you ask the American people, 3/4 or more of them, I think maybe nearly 100% of the American people are with me. Let's spend that money at home. Let's don't send that money overseas to people who hate us, to people who burn our flag. Keep it at home. There is a finite amount of money. We can't do everything. We can't fix everything if we have to fix everybody else's problems first. Let's address some of the needs we have here at home. So, Mr. President, I encourage a yes vote to vote to keep the money at home and not to send this overseas, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I regretfully am going to oppose this. I'm going to have to cover some points here that my good friend from Kentucky made that I think are totally wrong. First of all, I don't agree that we need to be going up there the federal dollars and bailing out cities that are having problems, and of course that's a decision that's going to be made, I suppose, by a lot of people. I also, when the senator from Kentucky talks about sending billions of dollars overseas, you know, there's some of the foreign aid I would agree with him on, and I would join him. Certainly not on this one. But before I tell you why, let me just clarify something, because there are people, members of this body and members outside, who are conservatives, believing this is some kind of a conservative program to defund the military in Egypt. Let me assure you it's not. And this is coming from a person who's probably, and in fact I'm certain of it, I've been ranked as the most conservative member of this body more than any other single person has. So this is coming from a conservative, not from a liberal, and not from a Democrat. We have a unique situation, and I'd like to respond to a couple of things that my friend from Kentucky said. First of all, yeah, it probably fits the description of a coup, and I know what the law is. The law says that you can't send money, foreign aid, after a coup. I have a bill drawn up right now that if this is determined to be a coup, it could pass the House and the Senate and be signed by the President in one day. So that's something that can be done, and I would have the best of intentions of obeying the law to the letter. Now, as far as the situation in Egypt, Morsi's gone. Let's face that reality. There are a lot of things that we don't like about this. But I will say this. If you have any feelings at all for our good friends, our best friends in the Middle East, that's Israel, then you can't consider this amendment. Israel has all of the interests at stake. And it goes back to 1979, the Camp David Accords, and I remember that very well. The Camp David Accords put together something between Israel and Egypt. But keep in mind, in Egypt, it's not Egypt, it's the military, the Egypt military. They have been our friends. They have been Israel's friends for years and years and years, and since 1979. And if we turn our backs on the military now, there are others who would love to fill that vacuum. Should they have F-16s? I'm glad they have F-16s. They ought to have more F-16s. And some have been purchased and not delivered yet. They should be delivered. But if it's not going to be F-16s, if we should pass an amendment like this, you're going to find yourselves with a bunch of MiG-29s coming over from Russia instead of our F-16s. If this were 10 years ago, if this were 15 years ago, I might agree with my friend from Kentucky. But that was before we realized the threats that we have in the Middle East. We have some friends in the Middle East. We have Israel, we have Jordan, we have Kuwait, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. If that coalition of friends in the Middle East breaks up, what can happen to us here in America? Our intelligence has said, and it's unclassified since 2007, that Iran will have the capability of a weapon and a delivery system by 2015. If we don't have our friends in the Middle East to keep that from happening, we could pass an amendment like this, turn our backs on Israel, and that is exactly the thing that could happen. So I know there are a lot of people who want to talk on this who are a lot more articulate than I am. But I can say from a conservative, from this conservative, we cannot do this to our friends from Israel and our other allies in the Middle East.
Mr. President.
The senator from Tennessee is...
I want to go in the appropriate order, and I see the chairman of the committee, so I'd like 5 minutes at some point, but you want to go ahead, Senator?
Mr. President, what is the parliamentary procedure? I understand that the opponents of this have 30 minutes. Is that correct?
The senator is correct. The senator from Oklahoma has used 5 minutes of the time in opposition.
All right, then I ask that unanimous consent that as the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I control the balance of the time.
Without objection, so ordered. The senator from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. President,
yes.
On the time it's going to be allocated.
Yeah, it is my intention to consume about 8 minutes approximately, to yield to Senator McCain 6 minutes, Senator Graham 6 minutes, and Senator Corker 5 minutes. And that should take the balance of our time. Mr. President, this amendment may be good politics, but it's bad policy. And I appreciate the gentleman from Kentucky's concern for Detroit. He and others in this chamber have had plenty of times to vote for America's cities, but I haven't seen those votes be there. And nothing in this amendment, notwithstanding what we heard, suggests that cutting all aid to Egypt ultimately means putting that money into the cities of America, such as Detroit. So let's not be mistaken about that. I share many of the concerns that have been raised by my colleagues today about the situation in Egypt. I believe, however, halting all military assistance to Egypt at this time is misguided and it is short-sighted. It would drastically reduce U.S. influence with both the interim government of Egypt and the military at an incredibly delicate time for Egypt and its people. And in so doing, it may in fact undermine our shared goals and desire to see elections and a democratically elected government reestablished in Egypt as quickly as possible. Now, it has been just a little more than 2 years since the onset of the Arab Spring and a revolution in Egypt that unseated Hosni Mubarak after 2 decades in power. During these tumultuous 2 years, Egypt has struggled as a society with a transition to democracy that its people clearly want, and with efforts to create the economic opportunities that its people clearly need. The struggle is real and ongoing. The demonstrations that ousted Mubarak in a clear military coup were unprecedented until they were eclipsed by demonstrations this summer, which drew as much as a third of Egypt's population of 83 million people onto its streets. That is more than 30 million people who have been emboldened by the revolution, who are united in their call for reform and democracy, and who have embraced their ability and right to peaceful protest and to demand change. If you think about it, a comparable protest in the United States involving a third of our nation would mean that 100 million Americans would be in the streets of the cities of America. That's the equivalent of what's been happening in Egypt. So, Mr. President, my point is that Egypt is changing, but perhaps not as quickly as we would like, and with a process that has not been, surprisingly, pretty chaotic. Abandoning our diplomacy and engagement in Egypt, a country that sits at the heart of the Middle East, because the road that leads to change is not straight or certain, would be naive. It might make us feel good, at least for a moment, but in the long run it would threaten to undermine vital national security interests and set back our values. Making such a significant change to U.S. foreign policy, with all the potential implications for U.S. national security and for our ally Israel, should not be done in haste. It should not be done carelessly or thoughtlessly. It should not be done without a full understanding of all of the ramifications of such a change. And it certainly should not be tacked on to the transportation, housing, and urban development appropriations bill. It is far too important a decision to be an afterthought to an appropriations bill. And in my view, it is ill-advised to make foreign policy on the fly without due consideration of all of the consequences. Now, I would point out that my friend from Kentucky has introduced an identical bill that has been referred to the Foreign Relations Committee. Last Thursday, the committee held its first extensive hearing on the crisis in Egypt. And I can assure my friend from Kentucky that the committee will continue to work on this issue and to look at the appropriate policy options through a deliberative process. We need time to determine whether the process underway in Egypt will meet the demands of the Egyptian people and lead back to democracy, or if the military leadership will dig in further and therefore invoke restrictions in U.S. law with respect to assistance. Our patience is not unlimited, and our assistance is not without limitations. The administration is already actively reviewing U.S. assistance. The delivery of 4 new F-16 aircraft that was to occur last week was halted by the administration, clearly sensitive to the situation. And at the end of the day, we should allow for flexibility to deal with this delicate situation as events dictate, not precipitate in an unwanted response with a knee-jerk reaction rather than deliberative reflection. The administration has a process to make its decisions. Now, I would say this is about far more, as I listened to the gentleman from Kentucky, far more than Egypt. He basically opposes all foreign assistance abroad. The reality is that foreign assistance abroad has worked to the national interest and security of the United States, saved millions of lives through PEPFAR against AIDS and HIV. It has helped strengthen democracies. It has helped create democracies. It has helped create open markets for American products and services. As a matter of fact, these sales to Egypt, about $1.2 billion, is largely from the manufacturers
of equipment here in the United States that create jobs here at home and then ultimately get used in Egypt. We need a more nuanced approach, one that speaks to both our values and our interests, and one which provides the President with the flexibility needed to conduct delicate and discriminating policy in a challenging and chaotic environment. A quick end to aid at this time, a meat cleaver approach when a scalpel is needed, is simply ill-advised. Last week, Ambassador Dennis Ross, whose reputation and experience as a diplomat, presidential advisor on the Middle East, and author has made him one of the nation's most respected foreign policy minds on both sides of the aisle, told the Foreign Relations Committee that, quote, "It is imperative that America stay in the game. We cannot and should not pull out now. Ending aid to Egypt would only cause Egyptians to shut out the United States of discussions and disregard our advice." Ambassador Ross also said that such an action could be the only thing to unite all Egyptians across the entire political spectrum against the United States. Against the United States. In fact, that opinion was shared by the majority panelists who feared our inability to influence events in Egypt if we were to step out of the game. In the interim, as we further assess the situation, our response and our policy must be carefully calibrated to press for the democratic reforms that the Egyptian people have demanded and simultaneously support U.S. national security interests in the region. U.S. assistance to Egypt has for decades helped support the Camp David Accords. It also supports our security interests in countering trafficking of weapons and people into the Sinai and in anti-terrorism cooperation with the United States. In recent weeks, Egypt's military has launched a major crackdown on terrorist activity and extremists in the Sinai Peninsula, carrying out arrests and attempting to seal smuggling tunnels connecting the Sinai to Gaza. U.S. cooperation is essential to the continuation of these activities. So let me conclude by saying, at the end of the day, Egyptian leaders and the Egyptian military must show that they are committed to an inclusive political process, credible democratic elections, and democratic governance that protects the rights of religious minorities, women, civil society leaders, and a diversity of political parties. That includes, from my perspective, vacating the June 4th verdicts for the 43 individuals convicted in the politically motivated trial of non-governmental organization workers, including 16 Americans, and permitting civil society organizations to reopen their offices and operate freely. It also clearly means an immediate cessation of arrests and use of force against peaceful protesters. Steps that exacerbate the divide in Egyptian society, including the use of force against protesters and arrest and harassment of pro-Morsi and Muslim Brotherhood leaders, serve only to deepen the chasm and forestall reconciliation. The only way forward to a pluralistic, vibrant, and stable democracy lies in the inclusion of all political parties and groups, as long as they are committed to a democratic process and to peaceful change. The United States has to move cautiously, not precipitously, in this delicate situation. The Paul Amendment is not our answer when it comes to our future relationship with Egypt. The future of that relationship will be determined by our actions in the coming weeks. Whether we will have a stable and willing partner on crucial matters of security, combating terrorism, trafficking of weapons and persons into the Sinai, and support for the Middle East is up to us. Or we can stand aside and just hope for the best. I think abandoning Egypt is a particularly poor choice, and that's why I oppose the amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
I have a couple unanimous consent requests, and I would also say this. This is an important debate, and I ask consent that on the floor now we have Corker, we have McCain, and Graham. I would ask that if they use more than the allotted time here, that they be allowed to use that, and that time would be whatever goes over the allotted time we have in the existing order, that would be given to
Is there
Senator
objection?
Paul.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that at 1 p.m. today, the Senate proceed to executive session to consider counter number 201, Todd Jones be Director of ATF. That be an hour for debate, equally divided in the usual form prior to vote on cloture on the nomination. That if cloture is invoked, all opposed cloture time be deemed expired, and the Senate proceed to vote on the confirmation with no intervening action or debate. The motion to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate. no further motion be in order to the nomination, that any related statements be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that upon disposition of the Paul amendment, the Senate recess until 1 p.m. today. Further, that the filing deadline for the first degree amendments to S 1243 be 1:30 p.m. today. That's the transportation bill. Finally, that when the Senate resumes legislative session following consideration of the Jones nomination, the Senate proceed to a period of morning business for an hour, equally divided between the two leaders or the designees, with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each, with the exception of Senator Inhofe, who is to be recognized for up to 30 minutes. Following the period of morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the power nomination under the previous order.
Is